What kind of values do you remember imparting to them?
The kind of values?
Were you strict with them too?
No, not as strict as, no. A lot of things that my dad did, I refused to do, because I don't believe in hitting children. I don't believe in spoiling a child either. My values are such that if you give enough love.
This is John Wayne Gacy, May 1992. 13 years after he confessed to murdering 33 young men and boys and burying most of them under his own house, he has had 13 years in a death row cell to think about exactly what he wants to say. This is the version he chose.
Accused of murdering 33 kids, and you say you didn't believe in hitting. I mean,
well, anybody that knows, you see, first of all, you're basing this garbage on what you've heard of me.
Over the next 2.5 hours, Gacy will describe himself as a loving father, a devoted husband, a productive member of his community. He will say that he believes in giving children love. He is saying these words approximately 150 miles from the crawl space where he buried 26 bodies, most of them in graves he had dug in advance. The clip you just watched is 20 seconds long. In those 20 seconds, there are at least 4 indicators that Gacy is lying. Not because he doesn't remember, because he has had 13 years to rehearse. January 14th, 1972. A Friday night, Greyhound bus terminal, West Randolph Street, downtown Chicago. The temperature outside is 14 degrees. Inside the terminal, it smells like diesel and stale coffee. A 16-year-old kid is sitting on one of the wooden benches. His name is Timothy Jack McCoy. He goes by Tim, 6'1", skinny. Brown hair parted on the side. He's holding a duffel bag between his feet. Tim is on his way home to Omaha. Coming back from visiting relatives in Michigan, he's stuck in Chicago overnight. The connecting bus to Omaha leaves in the morning. He has just enough money for a sandwich and a phone call home. He calls his parents, tells them he's safe. That's the last conversation they will ever have with him. At some point that night, a man approaches Tim inside the terminal. The man is 29 years old, 5'8", heavyset, wearing a dark winter coat over a contractor's work shirt. He is friendly, confident, easy to talk to. He tells Tim that the buses don't run this late, and he has a spare bedroom, a safe place to sleep, a ride to the bus station in the morning. He says it the way a person who has done this before says it, because he has, just not to completion. Tim gets in his car. The next morning, Tim's family in Omaha goes to the bus station to pick him up. He doesn't get off the bus. They wait until every passenger has cleared the platform. They check the next bus, then the bus after that. By that afternoon, they are calling the Chicago police. The Chicago police take a report, file it. Nothing happens for 7 years. Tim is buried in a crawl space under a kitchen floor in a single-story ranch house 22 miles northwest of where he disappeared. And the man who put him there goes to work the next day, hangs up his coat, eats breakfast with his wife, drives to a job site. The man's name is John Wayne Gacy, and almost nothing about his life will look unusual for the next 7 years. That's the part that gets people, not the killings. The fact that they didn't change anything about how he lived. He went to barbecues. He coached his stepdaughter's soccer team. He hosted a Polish Constitution Day parade in his neighborhood every May. He won a Jaycees Award for outstanding civic service. 3 years before the bodies came up, he had his picture taken with the First Lady of the United States, Rosalyn Carter. She is smiling at him. He is smiling back. There are 5 young men in a crawl space under his house on the day that photo is taken. He came home from that event and dug another grave. Within 12 hours, that's documented in trial testimony. Forensic psychologists call this the mask of sanity. The term comes from a 1941 book by a doctor named Hervey Cleckley. He spent his career studying patients who could perform normalcy so well that nobody around them could tell what was missing. And what's missing is the part that feels, not the part that thinks, The part that feels a psychopath knows what he did was wrong. Cognitively, he just doesn't have the emotional response that the rest of us would. He knows, but he doesn't feel, and that's why he can come home from a parade, dig a grave in his crawl space, go upstairs, and sleep 8 hours in his own bed. Most people, when they hear that, say something like, "How is that even possible?" The honest answer is that we don't fully know. Helen Morrison, the forensic psychiatrist who interviewed Gacy more than any other person, spent over 400 hours with him between 1979 and his execution. She wrote a book about him. After his death, she preserved his brain to study it, cut it into sections, looked at every region. She was hoping she would find something. A tumor, a lesion, a malformation, anything that would explain what he had become. She found nothing. The brain looked normal. Whatever Gacy was, it wasn't located in tissue she could photograph. It was somewhere else. Now, back to Chicago, back to that ranch house, 8213 West Somerdale Avenue. After Tim McCoy in 72, Gacy waited almost 2 years before the next one we know about, a teenage boy, identity unknown to this day, buried in the same crawl space. Then the gap between killings got shorter, then shorter, then shorter. By 1976, he was killing, on average, once every 2 months. By 1978, he was killing, on average, once every 24 days. The crawl space had room for 26. He kept count. He divided it into sections about 6 feet by 3 feet, sprinkled lime on the bodies to slow decomposition and cut the smell. When the crawl space filled up, he started using the garage. When the garage filled up, he started throwing them in the Des Plaines River. He was running out of property. That's how it ended. Not because anyone caught on, because he ran out of dirt. Stay with that for a second, because it tells you something important. For 7 years, inside a quiet suburban neighborhood, 2 streets over from a public elementary school, a man buried 33 young men under his house, and nobody noticed because he behaved exactly like everyone else. He had block parties, he waved at neighbors, he performed as Pogo the Clown at children's hospitals. And every single one of his victims fit the same profile. Young, male, often poor, often without family, who would push hard when they went missing. He was extremely careful about who he picked. That's not a man losing control. That's a man with a system. And the system worked until December 11th, 1978, the night a 15-year-old kid named Robert Piest walked out the back door of a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, to talk to a contractor about a job. Robert Piest was a different kind of victim. And Gacy didn't realize it until it was too late to do anything about it. Because Robert had a mother who was waiting outside in the parking lot, watching the back door. And when her son didn't come back, she didn't go home and wait. She walked into the police station that same night, and that single decision is the reason this case was ever solved at all. Okay, so Robert Piest, 15 years old, high school sophomore, gymnastics team, Eagle Scout, lived with his parents in Des Plaines, Illinois, worked part-time at this little drugstore on Touhy Avenue called Nissen Pharmacy. Monday night, December 11th, 1978. It's his mom's birthday. Elizabeth Piest drove over to the pharmacy to pick him up after his shift. They were going to go out to dinner. Robert tells her, "Hold on, Mom, I need to talk to this contractor real quick. Some guy's been offering him a summer construction job. Better money, a lot better than what the pharmacy was paying." So Elizabeth waits in the car. Parking lot's got those yellow streetlights. She watches her son walk out the back door. She checks her watch. 8 p.m. He said it'd just take a minute. 20 minutes go by, 30. And she gets that feeling, you know the one, every parent knows it, where your gut is screaming at you before your brain is willing to admit something's actually wrong. She goes inside the pharmacy. He's not there. She asks the manager. Manager makes a few calls. Nothing. Nobody knows where Robert went. And here's the thing about Elizabeth Piest. She didn't go home and wait it out. She didn't tell herself he'd show up. She drove straight to the Des Plaines police station. and walked through the front door. It was almost 10 p.m. Now, most apartments, most of them, they'd tell parents to go home, wait 24 hours, file a missing person report in the morning. That's the standard. But Robert was a minor. Different rules. They had to act on it that night. The cop who took the report, 21 years on the job, his name was Joseph Kozenczak. Everybody called him Joe. At the time, he was the lieutenant running the investigations division. Kozenczak listens to Elizabeth's story. Eagle Scout, honor student, goes outside to talk to a contractor, never comes back, and he doesn't write it off as a runaway. He puts a team on it that same night, goes back to the pharmacy, talks to the manager, asks what contractor was here tonight. Manager gives him a name, John Wayne Gacy, PDM Contractors. Kozenczak writes it down, runs it through the system, and within 2 hours, he knows he's looking at a name that already has problems. 1968, Iowa. Sodomy charge with a teenager, 10-year sentence. Served 18 months. Où ton parole? And now he's living in Chicago, running a company that hires young guys. The next morning, December 12th, Kozenczak knocks on Gacy's door. Gacy opens it. Pajamas, eyes puffy. Says he just woke up. Kozenczak asks if he met Robert Piest at the pharmacy the night before. Gacy thinks for a second. Then he goes, yeah, kid wanted a job. We talked in the parking lot. Then he left. That was it. Kozenczak asks him to come down to the station. Answer a few more questions. Gacy says sure. Be there in an hour. Just gotta get changed. Kozenczak goes back to the station and waits. Gacy doesn't show up in an hour. 2 hours. 4 hours. Finally, Gacy calls, says he's got an emergency at a job site. He'll come in later. And Kozenczak knows exactly what's happening here. Gacy's stalling, which means Gacy's got something he needs to deal with. Before the cops get any closer, Kozenczak files for a search warrant. 1:30 in the morning, December 13th. Gacy finally shows up at the station, mud on his clothes, hair's a mess. Visibly exhausted, Kozenczak goes, "Why are you so late?" Gacy says his uncle just died, had to take care of family stuff. And his guys check it. No uncle. Nobody in his family died. That's lie number one. Same night, Kozenczak's team hits the house with the first warrant. They don't find any bodies, but they find some stuff. A 1977 class ring engraved with a teenager's name, a kid who'd already been reported missing, a handful of IDs and different names, clothes in the closet that didn't fit Gacy, a book about pedophilia, and a smell coming up from the floor that, look, one of the officers later said it under oath. He said it smelled like a body, like something dead under the floorboards. But they didn't have enough yet to arrest Gacy on murder. What they had was enough to put him under 24-hour surveillance. Kozenczak puts 2 cops on him at all times. And for the next 8 days, Gacy knows he's being watched. And here's where Gacy does something weird. Something an innocent person doesn't do. He invites the cops tailing him into his house, offers them coffee, offers them dinner, gives them tours of the place, tells jokes, pours them drinks, tries to befriend them, tries to manage their suspicion by controlling the relationship. And this is a huge behavioral tell. When an innocent person gets tailed by cops, they're angry, they're insulted, they lawyer up, they don't make coffee for the surveillance team. A person with a normal conscience does not do that. One of the surveillance officers, Michael Albrecht, he later testified that one night, sitting inside Gacy's house, he started smelling something under the floor, something he'd smelled before. On the job, Albrecht gets up to use the bathroom. He flushes the toilet, and the plumbing pushes air back up through the crawl space vents. The smell hits the whole house. He knows immediately what it is. Albrecht goes outside, calls Kozenczak, says, "I think there are bodies in that house." Next night, December 21st, Kozenczak files for a second search warrant. This time, the warrant covers digging in the crawl space. An officer named Daniel Genty crawls down there with a flashlight and a shovel. He doesn't dig for 2 minutes. First strike of the shovel hits bone. Genty climbs out of the crawl space, white as a sheet, tells Kozenczak, We need a forensic team. Right now, they arrested Gacy that day, December 21st, 1978. He didn't fight it. On the ride to the station, he turns to the cops and asks if they want to hear his confession. And within 24 hours, he'd told the Des Plaines detectives a number that even they didn't believe at first. He said he killed about 30 people. He drew them a map, showed them the crawl space was divided into plots. Plot 1, Plot 2, Plot 3. He remembered who was in each one in order. For the next 26 days, the team's digging under that house. They had to put up tents over the crawl space because the news vans were lined up on both sides of the street, had to bring in heaters because the ground was frozen solid. 26 bodies in the crawl space, 3 under other parts of the floor, 4 in the Des Plaines River, total 33. And 8 of them at the time, nobody could identify. Trial starts February 1980. Jury deliberates less than 2 hours. Guilty, all 33 counts, death sentence. Gacy gets shipped off to Menard, the death row facility in southern Illinois. And once he's in that cell, this is where it gets interesting. Because in that cell, he starts doing something he's going to spend the next 13 years doing. He starts rewriting the story, the version where he didn't do it. He writes letters to journalists, takes phone interviews, paints clown portraits, and sells them by mail for thousands of dollars. And slowly over years, he builds this whole new narrative. The narrative is he was framed. Cops planted evidence. He had no idea about the bodies. A guy who worked for him named Rossi did it, or another employee, or a tenant. Anybody, just not him. And in May of 1992, 13 years after the verdict, a CBS Chicago reporter named Walter Jacobson gets permission to come into Menard and sit down with him. Now, Jacobson, this guy's no rookie. 60 years old, 30 years in journalism, interviewed presidents, mafia guys, a few other killers. He knows how to keep his cool in an interview room. He knows how to let his subject talk themselves into a corner. He knows when to shut up, when to push. And the 2.5 hours he spent with Gacy ended up being one of the longest interviews Gacy ever gave anybody after he went inside. And in those 2.5 hours, Gacy made one mistake. Just one, 20 seconds long. Most people watching wouldn't even catch it. You already heard those 20 seconds. At the start of this video, 2 questions from Jacobson and 1 answer from Gacy that he'd had 13 years to prepare for. Remember, at the start I said there are at least 4 indicators he's lying. This is that part. We're going to walk through it, one at a time, because the tells are subtle. Tell number 1. Jacobson asks, what kind of values do you remember? Imparting to them, Gacy goes the kind of values? That right there, that's a reflective question. Now look, when somebody asks you about something, that's actually part of who you are. Your kids, your childhood, real feelings, you don't repeat the question back at them. The answer's already there, it just comes out. You ask my mom how she raised her kids, she's not going to echo the question first. When somebody bounces the question back like that, one of 2 things is happening. Either they didn't understand you, or they're stalling because they need a few seconds to build the answer from scratch. Gacy understood the question. That's tell number 1. Tell number 2, Jacobson follows up. Were you strict with them too? Gacy goes, no. No, not as strict. No. A lot of things that my dad did, I refused to do. This is deflection. Textbook. The questions about him as a father, the answers about his dad as a father. Different person, different story. Gacy just changed the subject, and nobody in the room caught it. There's a term for this in forensic psychology. They call it responsibility transfer. You don't answer the question about you. You answer a question about somebody else, usually somebody worse, to make yourself look better by comparison. Tell number 3. The way he says the next line, I don't believe in hitting children. 2 stutters. In 8 words. Word repetition and mid-sentence pauses. In the research, this is called cognitive load. Your brain is trying to do 2 things at once, build the story and deliver the story at the same time. Truth tellers don't have to build. They're just pulling memories that already exist. Liars are different. They have to check every sentence before it leaves their mouth to make sure it matches the story they invented earlier. That takes work, cognitive work, and the work leaks out through the voice, through the stutters, through the little pauses. That's tell number 3. Tell number 4, the way he wraps it up. My values are such that if you give enough love to the children, that's a platitude. That's something anybody could say on TV at any time. Somebody who actually raised kids talks specific. They give you a story, a dinner, a lesson they tried to teach, a moment from their kid's life. They remember details. Somebody who's making it up talks general, because details are hard to keep straight. Details are where the story falls apart. Platitudes are safe. That's tell number 4. 4 tells. 20 seconds. 1 reflective question. 1 deflection. 2 stutters. 1 platitude to wrap. Now, and this is important, I'm not saying these tells prove Gacy was lying about hitting his kids specifically. I'm saying these tells prove he was building the answer in real time. A real father, asked about how he raised his kids, doesn't have to build anything. He just remembers. Gacy couldn't remember. He had to construct, because what he was actually trying to deliver wasn't the truth about being a dad. It was a public portrait, a portrait of a gentle father sitting on death row, a guy who didn't deserve to be there. And here's where I got to stop for a second, because there's something I've been thinking about the whole time I've been working on this case. Gacy isn't unique. That's the part that messes with you. Guys like him, they're not as rare as we want them to be. Let me give you 3 names. 3 guys, 3 countries, 3 decades. And I want you to watch how the same pattern shows up every time. Different system, same gap, same outcome. Dean Corll, Houston, Texas, 1970 to 1973, killed at least 28 teenage boys, worked at a candy factory, gave the local kids free candy. That's how he got the nickname the Candy Man. And here's the thing about Corll. The Houston police were getting reports. Parents were filing missing person cases. 28 kids vanished from the same neighborhood over 3 years. And the cops kept saying runaways. Houston PD literally had a category for them. They called it the runaway problem. Boys from poor families. Boys from broken homes. Cops figured they took off. Hopped a bus to California. Case closed. Corll wasn't caught by police work. He was caught because his teenage accomplice shot him to death in 1973, then walked into the police station and confessed everything. That's when the cops started digging. Now move the camera. London, England, 1978 to 1983. Dennis Nilsen, civil servant, ran a job placement office, killed at least 12 young men over 5 years, disposed of the bodies in his apartment. And how did Nilsen finally get caught? 1983, North London. A plumber comes out to fix a clogged drain on Cranley Gardens. What he pulled out of the pipes, he initially thought was chicken bones. Lab results came back the next day. The bones were human. That's how the British system caught him. Not detective work. Plumbing. One more. Soviet Union, Southern Russia, 1978 to 1990. Andrei Chikatilo, school teacher and factory clerk, killed at least 52 women and children over 12 years. Soviet police arrested him in 1984. 6 years before the killing stopped, they had him in custody, but the lab tested his blood type, and it didn't match the semen on the victims. So they let him go. Turns out Chikatilo had a rare condition. His blood type and his semen type didn't match. Lob error. He went on to kill another 21 people. Between 1984 and 1990, 21. Now look at the 4 cases side by side. Gacy in Chicago, Corll in Houston, Nilsen in London, Chikatilo in Russia. Different countries, different decades, different political systems. And the same thing happens every time. The system has the information. The system has the warning signs. The system fails to put the pieces together. And while the system fails, somebody else dies. Houston had 28 missing teenagers filed as runaways. London missed Nilsen for 5 years. Even though neighbors complained about smells, Chikatilo because of one bad lab test. And Chicago let Gacy out of an Iowa prison after 18 months of a 10-year sentence for assaulting a teenager. 18 months. Then he killed 33 people. That's the part I keep coming back to. That 18-month sentence in Iowa. Because if Gacy had served the full 10, or even half, he wouldn't have been on the street. In 1972, when Tim McCoy got off that bus in Chicago. And that's not a hypothetical. The parole board in Iowa had Gacy's full file, the original sex assault charge, letters from the victim's family asking him not to be released early. The board released him anyway. The reasoning at the time, he was a model prisoner, got his GED inside, joined the JC's chapter, built a miniature golf course for the inmates. And here's what nobody asked when they signed off on his parole. Why is this guy so good at performing? Why is a man convicted of assaulting a teenager already running a successful PR campaign inside the prison? Because if anyone had asked that question, if anyone had stopped to wonder why a child predator was suddenly so motivated to look good on paper, they might have caught it. The mask. What was actually underneath? Nobody asked. He got out, and 4 years later, the bodies started showing up under his house. You want to know what makes this case different from Corll, Nilsen, Chikatilo? Honestly, not much. Same gap, same failure, same pattern. The only thing that's different is whose family ended up paying for it. Okay, Helen Morrison, forensic psychiatrist, the one I mentioned earlier. She spent over 400 hours interviewing Gacy between his arrest and his execution, and after he died, May 10th, 1994, she got special permission to keep his brain. She wanted to find what made him him. She believed there had to be something, a tumor, a lesion, some structural difference that could explain why he'd been able to do what he did. She had it tested at multiple universities, sliced into sections, imaged, mapped, took years, and every test came back the same. The brain was normal. There was nothing wrong with it. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because we like to believe that people who do these things are broken in some way. We can see that if we just looked hard enough at the brain, we'd find the difference. We don't. Whatever Gacy was, it didn't show up under a microscope. It wasn't a malformation. It wasn't a tumor. It was something we still don't have a name for. And I think that's part of why this case stays with people, because deep down we want there to be a reason, a defect, a scan you could do, some way to spot the next one before he buys a house. 2 streets from an elementary school. There isn't one. Not yet, maybe not ever. The only signal we have is behavior. And behavior is a thing we have to actually watch for. And we don't, not consistently. Okay, last part of the story, Death Row Menard, late 1993. Gacy's been there 14 years. He's exhausted his appeals. The Illinois Supreme Court sets his execution date, May 10th, 1994. The day before his execution, they let him have a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. That night, he ordered his last meal, bucket of KFC, fries, fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, Diet Coke. And I want you to remember where this man started. 1964, Iowa, managing 3 KFC restaurants that belonged to his father-in-law. 30 years later, he's eating that same chicken on death row. That's not poetic. That's just how empty he was. He couldn't think of anything that meant something to him. So he ordered the food he'd been making for tourists back when his life still looked normal. Around midnight, May 10th, they let him into the chamber. Outside the prison, there were over 1,000 people. Some were anti-death penalty protesters. Most were not. Most of them were waiting for him to die, and they wanted to be there when it happened. The execution itself didn't go clean. The IV line clogged after the first drug went in. There was a delay of around 10 minutes. While they fixed it, he was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m. And here's the thing about his last words. There's no agreement on what he said. The state corrections director later told the press his last words were, "Taking my life will not compensate for the loss of others. The state is murdering me." The lead prosecutor, William Kunkel, who sat in the front row that night, says no words were spoken at all. Other reports say he said gismios, 3 different versions of the same moment, and honestly, that's fitting. A man who spent his whole life giving people different versions of himself left a final moment where nobody can agree on which version actually happened. Even at the end, he was unfinished. Even at the end, he was still the version he chose. Now, I want to bring you back to where we started. That night in Chicago, January 14th, 1972, the bus terminal, a 16-year-old kid named Tim McCoy, sitting on a wooden bench, holding a duffel bag. Earlier in the video, I told you he made a phone call that night. He called his parents, told them he was safe. That was the last conversation they ever had with him. I want to give you one detail I didn't give you the first time. The phone call, Tim called his parents because he wanted them to know what time to pick him up at the bus station the next morning. He wanted them there. He told them which gate. He told them what time. He was excited to be coming home. And his parents wrote it down. Their son was coming home tomorrow. And the next morning, his parents woke up early, got dressed, made the drive to the bus station. They stood at the gate Tim told them about. At the time Tim told them, and they waited for a bus that their son was never going to be on. That phone call, that's the last time he existed in their world as a normal person, on a normal bench, going home for a normal weekend, telling his mom what time to pick him up. 12 hours after that phone call, he was buried under a kitchen, and every interview Gacy ever gave, every one of those 13 years, he spent rewriting the story. Every word he said in that prison cell, none of it gave that family back. The one thing they actually wanted, their son at a bus station, coming home for a weekend, telling them what time to pick him up. That's where I want to leave you. Not with Gacy, not with the trial, not with the death chamber at Stateville, with Tim McCoy, 16 years old, on a bench, with a duffel bag. 5 families are still waiting to find out where their kid ended up. 5 people listed by case number in the Cook County records. 47 years later, their families never stopped wondering, and the only person who knew took that information with him into a chamber at 12:58 a.m. on May 10th, 1994. That's the part nobody can fix. Not the courts, not the cops, not Helen Morrison and her brain study, not me, not this video. The version he chose was the only version we ever got.